This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
What a week it's been. Chaos and death in Iraq, political upset at home, poverty, inequality, and as always, shootings and more shootings. In recognition of that last fact, right now we're going to have a little change of format here at the top of today's program. For the moment, ladies and gentlemen, we are not the Zero Hour. We are America's drive time radio station with all the information you need all the time. That means news on the ones, traffic and weather on the threes, and shootings on the tens. I just gave you the news. For traffic, this week saw the usual jams in big cities around the country as we continue our planet-killing addiction to oil. As for weather, it was hot and humid in much of the eastern half of the country, a condition which will keep getting worse because of our oil addiction, with more of the same expected for next week. And as long as we're talking about more of the same, that must mean it's time for today's gunfire report. Here we go. Shotgun fire broke out Saturday at a university in Seattle, Washington, killing one young person and injuring three others. In a common pattern, the shooter had previously been identified as dangerous, in this case by himself. The killer called 911 4 years ago and said he wanted to hurt himself and others. He was involuntarily committed after he said that he, quote, had a rage inside him, end quote. Nevertheless, he apparently had no difficulty obtaining a deadly weapon. In addition to a shotgun, the killer had a knife and many additional rounds of ammunition on his person when the shooting took place. Saturday also saw a loose gunfire event in Moncks Corner, South Carolina. While the details are not yet fully known, the event was apparently the result of another common pattern in which freely available firearms mix with criminal activity, the instinctive human tendency towards warlike territorialism, and the overconsumption of alcohol and recreational drugs. As a result, gunshots broke out at a block party in Moncks Corner. A teenage girl died and several other people were wounded. Police say that at least 7 different guns were used in the shooting, leading to a heavy and unexpected rain of bullets on the otherwise festive and sunny outdoor event. Sunday brought gunfire in Las Vegas, which began at a pizza place before coming to a head at a local Walmart. The dead numbered 5 in total, including the shooters themselves, a bystander, and 2 police officers. That shooting was the result of another common gunfire phenomenon, which develops as a result of ongoing and extreme right-wing fanaticism. The orphan count for that incident was 4 children left fatherless, all of them from the families of the slain police officers. One of those children was a baby who will never know her father. Tuesday saw munitions build up at an Oregon high school. Artillery included an AR-15 type rifle, a semi-automatic handgun, 9 loaded magazines bearing hundreds of rounds, and a large knife. There was moderate bullet precipitation, resulting in the deaths of 2 young people. According to a recent study, that shooting was the 74th time since last year's Sandy Hook massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, that a firearm was discharged inside a school building or on school grounds. Many of these incidents undoubtedly involved inner-city schools, where gunfire outbreaks appear to receive significantly less attention from broadcast news organizations. But here's an interesting fact that not all our listeners may know. Experts say that the level of parental grief experienced in these urban incidents is actually equivalent to the grief experienced at wealthier and whiter suburban schools. You may not have known that. The week before last, of course, was the week that we saw heavy gunfire rain down on the town of Isla Vista, California. To keep abreast of these daily developments and shootings, stay tuned to this station where we give you all the information you need for life in today's US of A. That's news on the ones, traffic and weather on the threes, and shootings on the tens. The forecast for next week? More of the same. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us for this segment and the following segment, we're delighted to say, is Terry O'Neill, a good friend of the program. She is, of course, the president of now the National Organization for Women. She is a feminist attorney, a professor, and an activist for social justice. She's been president of NOW since she was elected in June of 2009, and she's here with us to talk about a couple things, including Yes, All Women, and the response to the shootings in Isla Vista, California. Terry, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Richard, it's so great to talk to you again.
Well, thank you for that. And listen, one of the things that really affected me the most about the tragedy in Santa Barbara was the response online and the movement, the hashtag called Yes All Women, but also the fact that it felt as if it might be and could still be a teaching moment. I know I learned something from it, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is a teaching moment on a number of levels, really on a number of issues. It was one of the things that just really jumped out at me is how quickly that hashtag started trending. Eventually, you had, and within a short period of time, it had gotten I think 1 million hits within a week or two. The Twitter is a platform that women can access, and women do not have much of a megaphone, right? You look at corporate America, and you've got only 5% of CEOs are women, and the vast majority of them are white women. But younger women and women of color in particular are the highest users of Twitter. And the highest growing users of Twitter. And that's the platform, that's the megaphone. And what was really striking was how quickly the conversation just went global and how poignant the posts were. Mm-hmm. So the one, and I saw a number of variations of this post, but it went something like this. Hashtag Yes All Women, because I tell a guy I have a boyfriend to get him to stop hitting on me because he's more likely to respect a non-existent man than to respect me. And
absolutely.
I don't know any woman who hasn't done that. I promise you.
Which brings up a great point in terms of this, and I want to hear more of these, but for me as a man, listening to this, sometimes insight seems to be when something tells you something that at some level you already knew. And one of the things that struck me reading the Yes All Women hashtag comments was, I knew a lot of this already. I mean, I don't think any woman I know has not lived in the threat of sexually related violence in one way or another. I don't think any woman I know. I don't think the one you just read, I don't think any woman I know wouldn't answer any differently than you did, that of course she does that. And of course, I never thought about it, but of course it's because the guy hitting on her would respect a non-existent or mythical or real other male more than he would respect her. So that's what I think is part of the teaching moment in all this.
That exactly. That's and closing the loop. Because yes, I know so many women who've done that, but I don't know very many women who have closed the loop by saying, in other words, he respects non-existent men more than he respects the woman. That is a cultural piece. And, and I think so when we're thinking about these things, I really think we have to sort of manage somehow to keep these disparate strands of information in our heads all at the same time. I was talking to somebody the other day, and she said that the numbers of rapes on campus, right? We know now that approximately 1 in 5 women will be raped during their college career. But she was telling me that actually the number of men who commit rape on college campuses ranges by some estimates at 3% and by other estimates at 6%. That is a striking statistic on how rape is a serial crime mostly committed by predators.
Well, and
so we need to keep that in mind when we say, hashtag Yes All Women. All women have this experience and have experiences about that business of, telling them you have a boyfriend because you know that'll get them to stop hitting on you. That's pretty ubiquitous, but let's be clear, predatory behavior is a small slice of men,
Right.
and we need to figure out sort of how to remember those two pieces of information at the same time.
This gets to a really great point that I'd love to talk about with you, Terry, if we can, which is, I think there are, simplistically speaking, two categories of issues that have come up in terms of women feeling safe, women feeling respected, and everything that was catalyzed by this act of violence against women in terms of the male response. And, I've been in a lot of discussions about this, intergender discussions, where women will say legitimately, this is not about how we present this issue to you as men in a way that it works for you. This is not about you. And I get that.
Right.
But on the other hand, I think there are two categories here, and I think if we separate them, it might help the communication process. One is the act of serial predators, like you just described, the idea that one college man in 20 or one in 15 might be responsible for assaults on one woman in 5, one woman in 3, whatever the statistics turn out to be.
Right.
That maybe we need a different language for talking about that, because I know a lot of guys, and look, the other side of it is that my daughter in particular, was fascinated by Mad Men, the TV show. And I think she was fascinated. I asked her, and she said, yes, it's a glimpse in a world that we grew up in that was so profoundly sexist that it seems like an alien planet. But to her, and I'm delighted that there's been that much change, but we need so much more. And so many of us, particularly men, are refugees from that alien planet. So I think a lot of men who are well-intentioned get defensive and say, hey, I never raped anybody in college.
Right.
And I think there's maybe it's my job as a man, but I think there are two types of conversations to have with a guy like that. One is, no, you didn't. But you don't deserve a medal for that, number one. You don't get a medal for not being a predator.
Yeah.
And number two, what you do need to do is work on, as a man, on changing the culture that tolerates that looks away from that enables that, and to check your own, I know check your privilege is a sensitive topic now, but to check your own behavior when it comes to the things you do that are frightening or disturbing or unsettling, that you may not realize. Look, nobody's calling you bad in your soul or an evil person. They're just saying, look, you were programmed as a man to do and say certain things you thought were okay. It's just time to learn they're not okay. Does that kind of make sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I really do. I think that the Feminist Project has done enormous good by encouraging girls and women to think of themselves as a potential president of the United States, a potential president of a huge corporation, a leader in her community, a person who can solve problems because she's smart and capable and talented, and that she can use those talents to make her community better and to provide for her family. All of those things we've done really well with women. We've done quite well with men, actually, buying into women as contributors to their communities and women as providers for their families. More than half of women today are either the sole provider of their whole family or an essential provider, so essential that if she gets laid off within 60 days, they're not making the rent, right?
Right.
So men have been very good about supporting the women in their families. And you've got a lot of male support these days for closing the gender wage gap because they see all this money not coming to their family because their wives or their girlfriends are being underpaid. Okay. What I think the feminist movement has yet to do is to encourage men to conceive of themselves as recipients of women's provision, as recipients of women's leadership, as followers of women. Right now, I think male identity is still awfully wrapped up in these ideas of dominance. If there's one place where what we call rape culture shows itself over and over and over again, it's in high school football and college football and even professional football or other sports where scandals of sexual assault by a popular male sport figure is covered up by the community because the community protects the sports figure rather than protecting the sexual assault victim.
Right.
And I think that has to do with dominance. I think it has to do with this sense that we revere the men who are really, really dominant, over something. And if we can get away from that and really understand that true manhood is learning when to follow, right? When to receive, when to accept, and when to lead, and when to provide. And that's a piece of the feminist project that we have not succeeded at yet.
Yeah, I mean, as you describe it, we're going to go to a break in a second, but as you describe it, it sounds a little bit like dancing. I mean, the men were always taught, when we were 5 years old and had to wear our little suits and ties and everything, and went to dancing school that,
Oh,
you
yeah.
lead and she follows, but actually, sometimes you lead, sometimes she leads. We had the '60s. We learned that, when the Grateful Dead came out or whatever. We learned sometimes you lead the woman, sometimes she leads you. Now we just need to translate in that thinking into our everyday life. That's my simplistic analogy.
I think that's exactly right. I think as the closer we get to that, the better there will be. Although there's a book from, I think it was from the 1990s, and I've always liked the title of it, and it said the stronger women get, the more men love football. So
well, we'll have to finish that thought after the break, unfortunately. But we will be right back, and we'll see if that's true. We'll be right back with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, after these messages. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Terry O'Neill, feminist attorney, professor, and activist for social justice, and president of the National Organization for Women. Terry, I feel like there's so many ways we could take this conversation, but when we left, you were saying, what was the name of that book you mentioned?
The Stronger Women Get. Now, this is from the 1990s, and the book was The Stronger Women Get, the More Men Love Football. I think the author's point was that as women succeeded more and more in getting more and more rights and being able to move more and more into paid employment as opposed to unpaid work and other things, that she was seeing a cultural shift to sort of manly, a kind of a concern with manliness. What does it mean to be manly, a manly man? And so she was critiquing this shift over to considering something like a sport like football as the pinnacle of manhood. And in some ways, I think that she's right. I think that the forces of backlash, which always exist, no matter what kind of progress you're trying to make, whether it's civil rights or women's rights or LGBT rights, there's always going to be a backlash. And in the case of women's rights, the backlash very much takes the form of a sense that somehow men lose, and they lose their identity. Right. If women gain equality. The reality is that backlash is itself not succeeding. As I said, what we've seen in the past 10 years is strong increases in men's support for eliminating the wage gap for women, because they understand that the women are bringing that money into their family. What we're seeing is an increase in men's support for our efforts to stop the Catholic bishops from criminalizing abortion and even restricting birth control. So we are slowly but surely changing the culture and changing really what it means to be a man versus what it means to be a woman. But I think we have to be very cognizant of how difficult that change is and how focused we have to be in order to achieve the change.
And while we're on that topic, what it gets to me, and it always does, as you know, with me, is the economic dimension of all this, and the way that gender roles are used to perpetrate economic inequality. And as you're saying, men are beginning to see that in terms of equal pay. But you have, for example, the idea that the manly man and the little woman at home or whatever
Mm-hmm.
the current manifestation of that is also, in a sense, keeping whole classes of people down. But you get the inverse of that too, where there are ways in which it seems to me people try to cast economically or culturally negative stereotypes as somehow feminist. But and I know we're getting into a controversial area, but it seems to me, for example, that the idea that you see these articles about women learning to lap dance or something or dance on a flagpole or whatever they call it as a
Oh,
form
yeah.
of feminist empowerment. I don't buy it. I don't
Yeah.
buy that reinforcing the objectification of women as sexual objects does anything more than put a pseudo-feminist justification on the objectification of women. I was sent out to buy birthday presents for a friend's daughter. She was 8, and they were these Bratz dolls, Bratz, very sexualized for little girls. I don't buy that that's anything more than another way to sell product, commercialize people, and distract them from their own economic oppression. Am I getting it wrong?
I think you're absolutely getting it right. I think the commercialization of it is the key, because commercialization of anything has nothing to do with achieving equality for women or for any segment of the population. And, in terms of women's participation in the sort of gray market, the grayish part of the sex industry, to me, what you always need to look at is, let's look at the rates of violence against women in the workplace, and let's see where the rates of violence in the workplace are highest. Well, inevitably, you find that in the sex industry. That's a cold, hard fact.
Right.
If, in fact, pole dancing or stripping is culturally, and I want to make a distinction between individuals and cultures here, is culturally empowering to women, you would not see that sector have such extraordinarily high rates of violence against women in the workplace. And I'm talking about physical assault and sexual assault. Right.
Right.
So culturally, we know that the sex industry is not about empowering women. Culturally, it's not about making women stronger. Now, individually, I know women personally who have made money from stripping and from pole dancing, and I have nothing but respect for the particular women that I know. They had issues in their lives, they had food to put on the table, they had kids to support, and they did that. They did not do that because they thought they were making a strike for women's equality. They did it because they had some economic imperatives that they need to take care of right at that moment. That's a different thing.
And that's just to jump in. I just want to make clear, I wasn't talking about people who do it for a living. I was talking about this kind of movement you see where, like, young professional women or whatever, it's encouraged for them to think that this is somehow, that this not, to do it for fun, to do it. Look, you can do anything you want for fun. I don't care. But I think when you reinforce, I don't think it's a blow for feminism to reinforce an erotic exchange of signs or symbols that disempowers the older woman, disempowers the overweight woman, disempowers the disabled woman, disempowers the woman who just doesn't care to do that sort of thing.
Right.
So.
Yes.
That's all. That was the only point I was trying to make. But I want to pivot to some. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Say, and the other thing it doesn't do is it doesn't empower the caregiver, the woman who is working for minimum wage or less, doing elder care or child care, or anything that ends in care. Right. If you were really going to empower women, and you would see sort of women across the board becoming empowered. You don't. The sex industry is really not about that. You're absolutely right.
And one last topic I want to be sure to get to, because you called this week, and I think this is important to talk about this. You called this week for the Washington Post to fire George Will. And I want you to just talk about that, if you would, please, for a second, because I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, George Will absolutely needs to go. He put out a column that was actively damaging to victims of sexual assault. He derided and debased and demeaned them by claiming that they were greedy women, that they had something to gain by having been sexually assaulted. Many women, especially, well, not just especially on campuses, but many women experience prolonged PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from sexual assault. And here's George Will deriding their experience and claiming that they are actually benefiting from that experience. It's the same kind of active harm that Todd Aiken did when he said women who are legitimately raped. If you're legitimately raped, your body would shut down the ability to get pregnant. We know that 35,000 women are impregnated every year in this country from rape, and the thing is that when men say that, influential men who had in the past been deserving of respect. Todd Aiken was a respected politician running for the United States Senate. George Will has been a respected and powerful columnist in one of the most respected newspapers in this country. Men like that who say those kinds of things about sexual assault victims are re-traumatizing the victims. They are engaging in active re-traumatizing of those women. And that is why this column in particular, in my mind, so crosses the line that George Will needs to be dumped by the Washington Post.
See, here's why I so want to support you in this and do everything I can. I believe in freedom of speech. I say things that anger people. George Will has freedom of speech, but he doesn't have freedom to convey his speech as a columnist for a major newspaper. That is conferred upon somebody. And there's a difference between, in my mind, there are a wide range of opinions that are acceptable in discourse. What is not acceptable is the kind of opinion that is abusive and insulting to minorities, to people because of their identity, to victims. And in this case, I would say he's offended on multiple accounts in this incident, deeply offensive, by the way, deeply ignorant and unpleasant too. But in addition to that, I think we as a culture have a right to I don't want to say enforce, but to reiterate and establish certain norms. If he had written a column saying that Black people have privileged status when they're the victims of racially motivated assault, or that religious minorities, Muslims and Jews, receive a privileged status when somebody burns down their mosque or synagogue, he would be rightfully fired. And I think this is an offense of equal magnitude. And how can people help you with this effort?
Well, we are going to be going online with a petition to the Washington Post. So let me say, Richard, you're absolutely right. If it was talking about racism, look at what happened to Helen Thomas.
Great point.
Her anti-Semitic comments, and she paid an enormous price for that. George Will needs to pay no less a price. So yes, we haven't got it up on the website yet, but we are going to be demanding that the Washington Post dump George Will's column. He's a syndicated columnist, so he sells his column to a number of newspapers, but the Washington Post is the primary. And also there's another allied organization of ours, ultraviolet.org. I think it's weareultraviolet.org. They have a petition up. I'm encouraging everyone to go and sign their petition as well. But we really need to ratchet up the pressure on the Washington Post. Fred Hyatt, the publisher of the Washington Post, or the I can't remember his position.
He's editorial. I think he's editorial editor. Yeah.
That's it. Yes, the editorial. He has stood up for George Will and defended him vigorously. We need to change his mind, and I think we can if we have a multiple petition effort and just keep the pressure up on this.
Well, I'm going to make a request that you keep us posted on that, because we're going to keep on that and strongly support you in that effort. And look, if Fred Hyatt and the Washington Post ownership doesn't respond, maybe it will need to escalate. But I think that's a great cause and a very important one. And thank you for taking it on.
Thank you.
And Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, thanks so much, as always, for joining us. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you'll come back again sometime.
Me too. Anytime. Thanks.
Thank you. And we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us now is Elliot Fineman, who is president and CEO of the National Gun Victims Action Council, which he formed after the tragic death of his son, shot by a paranoid schizophrenic in 2006 with a legally obtained weapon. He is also host of a radio show here on WEAC Radio Network called It's the Guns Stupid, and it's called that because it is. Elliot, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, RJ, for having me. Big fan of you and big fan of your show.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm a great admirer of the work you do, which is tragically still just as needed as it's been in previous years, and it's astonishing. We don't seem to learn from experience over and over and over again. Why is that? You must have a theory.
Well, it's not that we don't learn. It's that there's a small group of very vocal, fanatic extremists who dominate the agenda or the media or the talking, points about all of this. And they've done it for so long that it's almost seeped into the culture by now. Such phrases as law-abiding citizens have a right to carry guns for self-defense are regularly, mouthed by the media, by the judiciary, by commentators, everywhere. And a statement like that has some kind of appeal, on a subconscious level. It seems reasonable. Gee, maybe people should be able to carry, weapons of self-defense. The only problem with that, and I'm just picking that one as a quick one to answer your question. There's only two problems with that statement: law-abiding citizens have a right to carry guns for self-defense, and that is that what's a law-abiding citizen? It's not a constant, as the NRA would have you agree. Every criminal was once a law-abiding citizen, so to ask me to put my faith in law-abiding citizens is foolish. Much as I'd like to, the evidence doesn't allow me to. And the other thing is that the element of surprise always defeats the gun carrier. If carrying a gun provided self-defense, for example, no police officers would ever get killed. And as we saw just horrifically the other day in Las Vegas, that's not the case. The element of surprise renders carrying the gun for self-defense essentially worthless. So
right, and in fact, the death count I talked about the Las Vegas shooting in my monologue. The death count in Las Vegas would arguably be one less if that bystander hadn't tried to step in with a gun. He would be alive today. Whereas in the shooting in Seattle, Washington, at the Christian University, the shooter was overpowered with pepper spray by a student guard. So we got our work cut out for us on this issue, and your latest battle front is Hallmark cards, which will surprise people a little bit, perhaps, but with graduations coming up and Father's Day and many occasions in the next several days to purchase cards, why Hallmark cards? What's going on there?
That's a question everyone asks because Hallmark is kind of the Norman Rockwell of our time.
Right.
There's three reasons, really, for why Hallmark, actually four. Why Hallmark specifically is that they, like every corporation in the country, including the NRA, I might add, bans guns in their corporate headquarters. Why would they ban guns in their corporate headquarters? Well, maybe they think they're dangerous. Of course, they know they're dangerous, so they ban them. But they don't call for a ban on guns in their Hallmark Gold Crown stores. You can come in with guns, and even if they wanted to say it's okay for people to come in with guns, which is outrageous enough, they could at least post a sign warning people that this is not a gun-free zone, that guns are welcome here. But of course they don't do that because they know how the people would not come in. The second, the third reason is that Hallmark was recently mistakenly put on the NRA's enemies list. They had published an old list, and Hallmark was on there because the prior chairman had supported, made a donation to a movement in Missouri that required a permit for for conceal and carry. So they were put on, and they responded. They were outraged that they were on the NRA enemies list, and their spokesperson emphatically put out a statement that Hallmark would never, ever oppose or support any anti-gun regulations. Now, anti-gun regulations are things like smart guns, according to the NRA. Any regulation is an anti-gun regulation. The NRA doesn't want background checks, for example. So, to the Hallmark's way of thinking, that would be an anti-gun regulation, and they would never support it. So, for those reasons, those are the three main reasons, of their direct actions. Additionally, if you go to their website, they publish and state emphatically, repetitively, that they support families, they support children, they're decent corporate citizens. They not only say they are, but they actually are in the communities they serve. And yet here's the number 2 killer of children, firearms, and they don't want to take a position. We teamed with the Newtown Victims and Clergy for Corporate Responsibility and wrote a letter to their chairman asking that he meet with us and explain, this paradox. Well, he refused.
And he wouldn't meet with. He didn't meet with you.
Wouldn't meet with us. And sorry.
And unfortunately, we've only got about a minute left, but a little less. But so, what can people do to support this boycott? You convinced me.
Okay. Well, just quickly, the chairman said they don't get involved in divisive issues, which of course is not true because they have 8 lobbyists getting involved in it. What people
and by saying they don't support gun laws, they've already gotten involved. So
Exactly.
Where can people go to find out more and support you on this?
Go to our website, www.gunvictimsaction.org. Don't buy Hallmark cards. We have cards you can download for free or send electronically for Father's Day and for graduation. And also, don't you send emails or post on their Facebook page or Twitter that Hallmark has to become a real corporate citizen. Support universal background checks and advocate for them. Not just the words, but to help us get them. We're going to move corporate America off the sidelines, and Hallmark's going to be the first one. So
great campaign, and I encourage people to do that. I'm going to do it myself. Everything you just said, Elliot Fineman, head of the National Gun Victims Action Council, boycott Hallmark. Thank you so much for being on the show.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And welcome back to the next segment of The Zero Hour. One of the other big news stories of the week, in addition to our continued pattern of shootings and violence, was what seems to be the utter collapse of civil order in Iraq. This was almost certainly inevitable. The brief history of Iraq is that there has always been a Shia majority, a Sunni minority, and a Kurd minority. There were some people who suggested, in the aftermath of our extraordinarily unwise invasion of that nation, that this country be split in 3, that either Joe Biden was talking about a straight-up partition of the 3 nations, whereas Ali Alawi, who was part of the transition government, suggested something more along the lines of federalization. We never did anything about that. We never bothered. We took the lazy person's way out. One military expert called our invasion of Iraq the worst. I don't remember the exact quote, but the gist was the least thought out military operation in modern history. As a result, it was catastrophic on every level, most of all in terms of restoring civil order. As a result of that, we saw the inevitable tragic and inevitable descent into violence this week, exacerbated by the fact that all we really ever had going for us in the so-called surge was the fact that we were paying off Sunni insurgents so that they would not make the problems even worse. Now, the Maliki government, which is not really a very legitimate government, but we backed it, did two things. One is, I got very tired of people telling me Barack Obama took us out of military involvement in Iraq. He wanted troops to stay. Maliki would not agree to it under his terms, so the troops, most of the troops had to go. That becomes relevant in a minute when we listen to a couple of clips. But so he didn't end the war in Iraq. We were kicked out. Maliki did not want to go along with the surge. He did not want to work with the Sunnis. He wanted to oppress them. Now, and there were a lot of the extremists that is encouraged and empowered on the Sunni side are more extreme than Al Qaeda. This group that's uprising now has been described, I think probably rightfully so, as more extreme than Al Qaeda. We've allowed the situation to go to hell. So naturally, where does the media turn for advice, input, political commentary? The Republicans who got us in the mess in the first place. So first off, let's hear from John Boehner, Speaker of the House. The Orange Man himself had some words on this. Let's hear them.
It's not like we haven't seen over the last 5 or 6 months these terrorists moving in, taking control of western Iraq. Now they've taken control of Mosul. They're 100 miles from Baghdad. And what's the president doing? Taking a nap.
So here's a guy who supported the worst thought out intervention in modern military history, and he's accusing the president of taking a nap. What does that even mean? But for real idiocy on this topic of Iraq, and believe me, the Democrats and the president have been profoundly disappointing on this issue, but let's go to the man who, as a presidential candidate, couldn't tell you the difference between Sunni and Shia and didn't even know there was a difference. We speak, of course, of Senator John McCain. Here's what Senator McCain had to say.
Afghanistan. Because the President of the United States declares a conflict over does not mean in the eyes of the enemy that it's over.
Let's stop for a second. As we said earlier, the president didn't declare the conflict over. Maliki threw him out. Our guy, we picked the wrong guy. We backed the wrong guy. Backed him since Bush. Keep going.
17, when the final American is scheduled to leave Afghanistan. Please learn the lessons. I say to the President of the United States, get a new national security team in place. You have been ill-served by the national security team and the decisions that you have in place now and the decisions that you made.
Okay, let's hold for a second. By the way, this is McCain's old school in a way that I kind of like. When you insult the guy's team, you're really insulting the guy. So he's not insulting the guy. He's respecting at least that you don't insult the commander-in-chief, which is something they're into. But that's what he's really doing. It's saying that Obama is incompetent. Secondly, you heard him mention Afghanistan. I mean, arguably, look, Obama let that war go on way too long for no reason in order to support these nitwits we're backing over there. But hey, you guys, so let's go on. Let's continue for a second.
The black flags of Al-Qaeda fly over the city of Fallujah today. 96 brave soldiers and Marines were killed, 600 wounded. What do we tell their families? What do we tell their families? What do we tell their mothers?
Let's stop here. Here's what we tell their mothers. Here's what we tell their families. We had a party and a president loyally backed too much of the time by his entire Republican following, who took us into a foolish war, and it had tragic consequences for Iraq, and it had tragic consequences for their families too. And I'm sorry we didn't have the leadership needed to prevent that. Is there any more McCain audio?
So it's not too late. America is still the most powerful nation on earth. We still have the finest and strongest military ever. We have the finest young men and women who are serving in it ever. It is not too late. But we've got to have a dramatic reversal of course.
Now, what is he talking about when he talks about a dramatic reversal of course? I'll tell you what he's talking about. He's talking about putting boots back on the ground. He's talking about repeating the mistake that will lead to the same inevitable outcome, because that's the geographic composition of the country. He's talking about having to make that speech to more mothers, to more families, to more people who have lost loved ones for no good reason. You know, this is, look, between John McCain, who puts himself out, I applaud him for his sacrifice, but to put himself out as an expert in foreign policy when he's consistently been wrong on foreign policy issues, consistently been wrong on military issues, when as a presidential candidate he was asked about the difference between Sunni and Shia, which is the central issue in Iraq, where he was saying we needed to be more aggressive militarily, couldn't answer and had to be rescued by Joe Lieberman. This is the guy telling us we need to go deeper into it. Then we've got John Boehner. What does it mean? I said, I don't know what it means when he says Obama is taking a nap. There is one interpretation for what it means, which is that it is some sort of racist dog whistle against the stereotype of minorities as being lazy. Other than that, it's an utterly incomprehensible thing to say. This is who we have for a so-called loyal opposition in this country. We have a military and humanitarian disaster on our hands in Iraq. We need to get the world community together to help with the humanitarian piece of it and to negotiate a peaceful outcome. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. With us now is David Dayden, who is one of the great writers on financial and economic issues today. He is a contributing writer to Salon.com, where I write from time to time as well. He's a weekly columnist at the Fiscal Times, and he started out as a blogger before becoming a freelance journalist. There is life after blogging. He writes for a lot of different publications, too many to name here, and he's been on a number of outlets. He's contributed to 2 anthology books. He had prior to writing about politics and economics, he had a 17-year career as a television producer and editor, which explains a lot. No, it doesn't. Hey, Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Listen, there's so much we could talk about. There's so much going on right now, and you and I have both been covering a couple of things. But why don't we start with, we haven't said much on today's program about, we've only mentioned in passing, the big news event of the week, which both you and I wrote about, with roughly the same angle, which is Eric Cantor's loss. He wrote a piece for Naked Capitalism, Cantor's Loss, a Triumph for Anti-Corporate Right-Wing Populism, which is the same take I had on it. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. Eric Cantor kind of made his bacon and attained this height of being the House Majority Leader through a very close relationship with corporate lobbyists. And one thing, perhaps the main thing, that David Brat, who is his challenger, the Republican, did in trying to oust Cantor was to talk about this and to really go after these ties that Cantor had, and do it in a very populist manner. Now, a lot of pundits and observers have talked about the focus on immigration and sort of blaming Cantor for promoting amnesty, but this was put out there in a very much a populist way, which actually combines with a bit of a nativist way, saying that the influx of cheap labor that is being attempted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who supports immigration reform, would take away jobs from domestic workers. So that was sort of the idea. And the key piece of mail that went out showed Cantor with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who is someone who's publicly come out for immigration reform. And I think this was meant to get across that, Cantor is in bed with big business and not looking out for your interests. There were several indications of this throughout the campaign, and it appears to have been successful.
And you know your history, so you know that the dark side of populism has always been this kind of nativist element.
Absolutely.
But you make a great point, which is that that even the immigration piece that people are emphasizing had an anti-corporate tone to it. And I think that there are a lot of people on the left, a lot of commentators have made a mistake, in my opinion, which is, I'm curious your thoughts, which is they say, well, don't celebrate this because David Bratt is an awful human being, and you would not. He's a terrible person to celebrate. But I think there's a difference. This is not a celebration of David Bratt. This is an illustration of the fact that populism sells. One of his catchy lines. One of his catchy lines. He says, "I'm talking about the crooks. They didn't go to jail. They went on to Eric Cantor's Rolodex."
Right.
So
Right. And specifically, those crooks he's talking about are people from Goldman Sachs and the investment banks in New York. That's usually how he prefaced that. And so it does illustrate that this kind of talking about people who look out for corporate interests over constituents. You can get rewarded when you do that, and you can get rewarded on the right as easily as you can get rewarded on the left. Certainly, the Democratic Party has no shortage of corporate stooges, to put it mildly, and there is opportunity there from a campaign context to do that. I don't know how much opportunity there's going to be to work with David Bratt in a governing context. But the idea that people, who are strained and vulnerable in this economy are fed up with a government they feel doesn't work for them is very notable.
Well, I agree with you on all counts, and I think that there is a lesson here. And I don't know if you saw Hillary Clinton's reaction. I mentioned it in my piece, which is her reaction. Somebody asked her about Eric Cantor's defeat, and she said, well, this guy ran by bashing immigration reform, and we believe in immigration reform. My take, and I'm curious for yours, my take on that was if you were an anti-populist corporate Democrat, as I consider Hillary Clinton to be, based on all the evidence, that's exactly what you're going to say. You're going to discount the populist element in the David Bratt victory because that's threatening to you. You don't want to encourage that line of thinking. But am I off base?
No. In a sense, the intensity of the war over what Eric Cantor's loss means has been about 100 times more intense than the actual campaign. We're talking about 66,000 voters in a district in Virginia. I think the turnout level was about 13% or something like that. So we shouldn't read too much into it. But what we should do is take note of the fact that, Cantor was kind of a liaison to the Tea Party among the Republican leadership, and there was this little sleight of hand that was going on within the Republican Party where the Tea Party would be, spouting this rhetoric that sounded populist and anti-corporate, but it would get translated into this backdoor dealing with Wall Street and other, multinational corporations. So to sever that relationship, I think is very important. Whether it results in any kind of transpartisan coalitions remains to be seen. But I think it is important to just call out the double dealing that was going on, and frankly, that happens in both parties. where the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. And so any time that changes and that gets severed, I think is pretty good for democracy.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And by the way, I'm not one of the people pushing the possibility for a transpartisan partnership based on populism. Right. I know Ralph Nader wrote a book like that, but it sounds like science fiction to me. But what I am interested in is the read of the. And yes, absolutely, Dave, you're completely right that we could, and many people do, oversell the significance of a handful of voters in one district. But I think, if you look at a pattern, you look at the polling data that says that 76% of Tea Partiers don't want Social Security cut to benefit the deficit, or, a majority of Republicans think the millionaire's tax is a good idea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You start to think, a majority of Republicans think that, or a plurality think that we ought to regulate Wall Street more, et cetera. You start to think, well, maybe there's something here. Maybe it's worth at least noting.
I think the lesson is that these kinds of policy ideas sell, and Democrats should work to try to sell them in districts, and that includes in primaries, and maybe they'll be successful.
Right. I mean, I would think, look, if I look at the motivation of a member of Congress or a presidential candidate or a senatorial candidate, there's always going to be an enormous temptation to go corporate and get corporate money, but and look, the story isn't written about where the dark money for David Brack came from. They say he was outspent by 20 to 1, 40 to 1, but was there dark money in there and so on? But at the end of the day, if people can rally, especially at these local low turnout congressional primary elections, can rally the base and get a different outcome, that would get somebody's attention and maybe be a positive development. Any final thoughts before we go to break on the Bratt thing? Because we got a couple other things to talk about after our break. Any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I just generally agree with that, and we'll have to see how this translates. But there are groups between Blue America and the Progressive Change Campaign Committee who are working on this level. I mean, certainly over the last year, we've seen a renaissance in the Democratic Party in talking about expanding Social Security rather than cutting it. Those are some of the examples of the kinds of policies that might have a really positive response from a populist standpoint.
All right. Well, we'll be back in several minutes after these messages with David Dayden, and we will switch to a couple other populist topics like student loans. Dave, thanks so much for being with us, and please hang out, and we'll talk a little more after these breaks. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. We are back on the Zero Hour. We are talking with politics and economics writer David Dayden about a variety of subjects. The one I wanted to pivot to now was student loans. You and I both responded to Shaheen Nassipour's reporting in the Huffington Post about Navient, the loan servicer that was split off from Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae, of course, being the government-sponsored enterprise that was taken private and immediately started behaving in predatory, nasty sorts of ways. Navient abused and cheated a number, about 60,000, one estimate, service members. And the outcome, well, why don't you tell us from your point of view what the outcome was?
Well, they were fined about $139 million for, among other things, those violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, giving higher interest rates than the cap on service members for their private student loans, and a variety of other abuses. But the Department of Education is close to confirming a new contract with Navient for $899 million. So, that easily covers the cost of the penalties that were assessed by federal law enforcement on Navient. My real question here is, why do we have student loan services? I understand it in the mortgage context when private investors own the mortgage and don't have the expertise to actually service the loans in terms of collecting the monthly payments and things like that. The U.S. government has the largest accounts receivable agency in the world, known as the Internal Revenue Service. They are administering 85 to 90% of all loans, federal loans. Why are they hiring a company that is an incompetent and fraudulent company at that to service loans when they have the complete capacity to collect payments themselves? In fact, in President Obama's regulatory actions that he took over the past week, a lot of the actions in there are to essentially end run the servicers. They're partnering with H&R Block and Intuit to give better information on alternatives to borrowers, which is something servicers should be doing. They are making automatic the interest rates that go to service members, which is what servicers should be doing. I mean, a large amount of the rules are essentially to go around these incompetent servicers, and yet we're still paying them for no reason that I can discern. So that's the larger point that I think I have around the whole concept of student loan servicing when these are federally administered loans.
And I think, obviously you're asking the question from a functional perspective, but as you know, from a historical perspective, why do we have them? Because the brilliant, in the bipartisan craze to privatize government functions,
Absolutely.
Sallie Mae became a privatized corporation and began behaving badly. And you may remember, I don't know if you remember, I did a piece where I found out they had 2 corporate jets, and I got the ID numbers and got pictures of them. And, government completely only exists because of government, only services student loans, and they're flying around to corporate jets, giving $250,000 to George Bush's inauguration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Navient, which was their internal servicing arm, was spun off as another publicly traded company, traded on NASDAQ. So there's a lot of money changing hands.
It's in a lot of respects. In a lot of respects, it's similar to Medicare Advantage, right? This is this private entity that was spun off, a separate program that essentially is a partial privatization of Medicare. So private companies can supply Medicare insurance, and as we know, it's more expensive, and it's to such a degree that in the Affordable Care Act, there was hundreds of billions of dollars that were saved by limiting these overpayments to Medicare Advantage. So this is another example, and a really egregious example, when you have the federal government making rules and executive orders to bypass the student loan servicers that they are paying large sums of money to service student loans.
Right. And when we know, for example, that student loan servicer, in the case of U.S. military, was doing things like when those troops were eligible for lower rate student loans, telling them, oh, no, you don't get that rate unless you were deployed overseas in an act, just lying. So now here's something I think you and I also agree on. You asked the question, why do we have student loan servicers? End game for me, and I think for you as well, why do we have student loans? I wrote a piece called Free Higher Education is a Human Right, or should be. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we talk a lot about this crushing burden of student debt, and it's over $1.2 trillion. It's more money than any set of debt other than mortgages. There's more student debt than credit card debt. We talk about all this. And in general, the political conversation is about how to make those loans more affordable. And what the political conversation should be how to make those loans irrelevant. There is enough money through grants and aid, through subsidies, that is spent right now on higher education to make public higher education at public colleges and universities absolutely free. We could do that. If somebody wants to go to a private university, have a different manner of education, they're free to do that. The public doesn't necessarily have to subsidize that if they give them a public option that is separate and apart at public colleges and universities and community colleges and the like, that is free to students. And that's everything that's free, not just tuition, but books and fees and things like that. So it's possible. It's extremely possible. It just would require a complete transformation of this vision of, the higher education as a market and all of the various things that we have, and changing that vision to one where higher education is an investment in the future, and we should not be harming our economy and causing self-inflicted wounds by crushing young college graduates, 21, 22, 23 years old, with this giant debt that that forces them to delay major purchases of autos and homes, and has a really deleterious effect on our economic future.
And tossing them into a job market that's the worst in modern history for them. And by the way, you're not talking about pie-in-the-sky stuff. You're talking about kind of a European norm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Many European, many industrialized nations have this model already in hand. There's one called the United States of America that has this model. Certainly where I live and where you live in California, the Master Plan for Education in the 1960s had college education at very prestigious public universities here in California as a free and available to residents of the state. And that arguably was one of the main reasons why the California economy soared through the 1950s and 1960s. And we can thank Pat Brown for that, who was Jerry Brown's father, who was the governor from 1958 to 1966. So not only is it, are there international models for this, there are models right here in America that prove that this can work. And the important thing is the money is there. We already, with tax preferences and grants and all of these kinds of things, have the funding available to make this a reality.
And as you know, I think you probably know, but a study came out that showed that a lot of those tax preference intended to sacrifice government revenue for the good of students actually disproportionately goes to higher income students, not to lower income students who could most benefit from it. But now, in the minute or two we have left, I just want to hit on one other topic. Watch this segue, Dave. Okay, so if we had free private higher education, that would also conceivably have a market effect on private schools and who overpay their executives. One of those private school CEOs or presidents was, of course, Harvard with Larry Summers. Now, you wrote recently about, you see where I'm going. You wrote recently about Larry Summers and the housing crisis. And you had a couple observations about that. Want to just tell us briefly what they were?
Sure. I wrote about this book called The House of Debt, which is a great book by two professors, Atif Mian and Amir Sufi. Larry Summers also wrote a review of this book. And he, in it, the main criticism in House of Debt is that the Obama administration should have done more to restructure mortgage debt in the wake of the crisis. That was the reason. This burden of debt from the popping of the housing bubble was the reason why we had a severe recession and a very slow recovery. Summers kind of agreed with that, but also objected to the fact that the administration didn't do everything they could. And it was a very weird way in which he went about this. He said that the administration did not have a banking view, in other words, a view of save the banks, save the economy, which was the main criticism of Sufi and Mian. But at the same time, his objections to restructuring mortgage debt largely revolved around the fact that the banks would be hurt by such a policy. So it was a really strange kind of assessment that Summers was saying, no, we didn't have a banking view. We wanted to help homeowners too, but you don't understand, helping homeowners would have hurt the banks. So it was this weird circular logic that he was going through, and it's a very interesting book, and I do recommend it to everybody.
Yes, we had Amir Sufi on the show. He was great.
Oh, fantastic!
And
Fantastic.
yeah, and we recommended also, and Summers. This just speaks to my theory that these guys are so embedded in this way of thinking that they can't they can't even see that it exists.
Absolutely.
But listen,
I
Dave.
totally agree.
Yeah, thanks. David Dayden, you do fantastic work. I'm a big fan of your writing, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show, Richard. Appreciate it.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. That was David Dayden of Salon and many other publications. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is... And we are back on the Zero Hour. I had a few news stories I wanted to share with you before the end of this segment. As you know, we like to just kind of scan the news. Here's one that jumped out. Cuomo, referring, of course, to the governor of New York, who was elected as a liberal Democrat, but has come to be known as Governor 1%. Cuomo, this is the headline from ProPublica, which does great work. Cuomo has raised millions through loophole he pledged to close. The governor has called for closing a gap in the state's campaign finance laws, but he's taken far more through the loophole than his predecessors, much of it from real estate developers. A loophole in the state's campaign finance regulations allowing corporations and individuals to pour unlimited amounts of money into politics has yet to be closed. Instead, Cuomo has become the loophole's biggest beneficiary. What the loophole does basically is it allows rich individuals or corporations it limits their donations, but allows subsidiary associations or creations that they incorporate to contribute large sums of money, and they can incorporate as many as they want. So it's functionally unlimited, and he is taking advantage of that. So more on we'll be following the Governor Cuomo story and the working families party angle of it in the coming weeks and months. It will be interesting. Now, here's an interesting piece: why Hillary Clinton isn't too old for 2016. There's more to the story than where Hillary Clinton's age would rank among presidents if she were to be sworn in 2017. And this is a good point for Democrats and Hillary supporters to remember. She'll have about as many years left as some of the 50-somethings who were president in an earlier era, according to life expectancy tables. This is important for a variety of reasons, one of which is in terms of the debate on Social Security. Everybody says, well, everybody's living longer, so we need to cut Social Security. Not true. Some segments of the population are living longer. She, and the article goes on to explain this, Hillary Clinton, as a white person, has an advantage in longevity. As a woman, she has an advantage in longevity. As a wealthy person, she has an advantage in longevity. So it's not that everybody is living longer. It's that certain people are living longer. But that is, when you factor in infant mortality, Social Security is easily remedied and can be expanded. So she is not, but I agree that she is not too old for 2016. The data clearly show that. And then here's an interesting article, related topic. How old is too old for president, according to the public? Depends on who's running. And this article says, does a candidate's age matter in presidential elections? It's less relevant than you think, because a Pew poll asked voters how likely they would be to support various candidates with different traits, religion and so on. But in 2008, they found Democrats were the most likely to raise concerns about electing an older presidential candidate. Remember, Reagan was the oldest president on record. Bob Dole would have been in his early 70s if elected. John McCain would have been in his early 70s if elected. So back then, Democrats were of the opinion that it was a concern if a candidate was too old. Now it's flipped. Now Democrats say that they don't think it's a concern. But far fewer of them think it's a concern if a presidential candidate is older, but Republicans are concerned. Interesting, huh? A Democrat or Republican, there's a lot of unconscious bias going on. In a related topic, MRI scans reveal effect of quote-unquote mob mentality on the human brain. All of us will have and what the article basically says is that one-on-one interactions are usually governed by a common sense of humanity, but when ideas like us and them enter into the equation, things turn nasty very quickly, as this article says, and these MRI studies show it, that when people are included in a group and they're told they're competing, they become much less uh, receptive to messages, much less open-minded. There was, as this article says, markedly less activity in the part of the brain where moral messages, when they were given moral messages, as opposed to when they were not part of a team. In other words, it kind of turned off their internal moral guidance and became less moral when they were part of a group. Interesting thing to think about, whether you're thinking about a movement, the political party you belong to, or any other way you identify yourself. Now, for something completely different, and speaking of longevity, by the way, Poppy, the world's oldest cat, has died at the age of 24. Poppy died at the ripe old age of 24. She was born in February of 1990. She just died this past week, the same month, as this points out, as the Guinness Book of World Records points out, the same month that Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Poppy lived through the tenures of 5 British prime ministers, and I hope she wasn't following the news because it hasn't been pretty. She is reported to have passed away following a problem with her hind legs and a water infection. Now, if those formulas are wrong and simplistic about 5 years for a cat's life is a 1 human year or whatever, but if they're true, then Poppy was 120, and I think anybody who's 120 will have problems with their hind legs and water infections. Her owner, Jackie, said people always ask what we put Poppy's longevity down to, and I guess she had a good diet, lots of exercise. She had biscuits in the morning and tin food later on. She is partial to the odd takeaway. They were British. We sometimes give her a bit of KFC chicken, fish and chips, and even the odd bit of kebab meat. So Poppy was multicultural in her tastes. I suspect that genetics were the dominant factor. We will be talking about that sort of thing in our next hour when we talk about human enhancement. But from Andrew Cuomo to Poppy, we live in a world where personal preference sometimes guides our behavior. Andrew Cuomo has conveniently forgotten the principles upon which he ran. Hillary Clinton will not be too old to be president. After all, if she were Poppy, she'd only be 17 or so, maybe 15. Democrats are just as herd-minded as Republicans when it comes to thinking about things like age. They don't like it when Bob Dole or John McCain is running. They don't think it's a problem when Hillary Clinton is running. So think about that. When you don't get too identified with a political party, folks. Get identified with an outcome. That MRI scans show we turn off our moral messages when we think of ourselves as part of a group, and we give our condolences to the family of Poppy, the world's oldest cat. We will remember you fondly, as we will remember all the pets in our lives and all the causes and people who have made it worth living. We'll have a great hour coming up in the next and final hour of this week's show. We'll be talking about human enhancement and a new way to look at economics and the GDP and all kinds of fun stuff. So please stick with us. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back for our final hour of The Zero Hour. This week, we're going to look at different ways of viewing the world. We will be talking with Sean McElwee about his editorial, which he co-authored, on getting rid of the GDP and looking at new ways to measure economic progress. I think that'll be a fascinating topic. We'll devote the rest of the hour to talking about artificial intelligence, and especially a news item about a program which reportedly passed what they call the Turing test. Now, the Turing test was invented by mathematician Alan Turing, who was a hero during the Second World War for code breaking. He suggested that when a computer could convince one person out of three that it was a real human being, what he said has been misinterpreted. What has come to believe that is if a computer can do that, then we've made a major milestone on the way to creating artificial intelligence. Now, here's what Lance Ulanoff of Mashable said about that. He said a team of programmers and technologists backed by a computer and some algorithms. Eugene Goostman, the name of this algorithm, was able to fool the Turing test 2014 judges 1/3 of the time, good enough to surpass the threshold set by computer scientist Alan Turing in 1950. Turing believed that by 2000, computers would be able to, through 5-minute text-based conversations, fool humans into believing they were flesh and blood at least 30% of the time. Depending on who you talk to, Goostman's achievement is either a huge turning point for technology or just another blip. Some of the harshest criticisms take Turing test 2014 host University of Reading to task for what may have been too simple a task. Several experts, including, and remember this name, scientist Hugh Loebner, don't buy the results. Loebner runs his own competition and calls the 5-minute test length too short. His test is 25 minutes. Now, I have already been on record as a skeptic of the Turing test. There was a John Lennon artificial intelligence that was written up about 6 or 7 years ago, and I wrote a piece about it for a philosophical publication called I Don't Believe in Turing. And the reason was because it doesn't pass the smell test of human conversation. So we're going to be talking with our producer, as well as with futurist George Dvorsky about this topic. Pete did an interesting experiment. I did a couple too with Eugene Goostman, and I just want to share those results with you, and I think you may understand what I mean. I call this first script Eugene and Julie. I wondered what would happen if Eugene, when we were brainstorming about this, what would happen if Eugene, the artificial intelligence, which passed the Turing test, was put in a conversation with Julie. Julie is Amtrak's voice bot. When you call Amtrak, you get a voice that says, "Hi, I'm Julie." And Julie is supposed to take you through your reservations. So I wondered what would happen if Eugene and Julie talked. So using myself as Eugene's voice, typing in Julie's answers for Eugene to respond to, here's what I got. "Hi, I'm Julie, Amtrak's automated agent. After the call, would you like to take a quick survey?" Eugene: "No. God save me. Propose it to Dr. Loebner," and that's the one who's a skeptic. "He is eccentric enough to like your ideas." Ooh, anything else? You buying it so far? Julie: "To check if a particular train is running on time, say train status, or to get schedule and price information, say schedule. For new and existing reservations, say reservations. Or you can also say pick something else." Eugene: "Julie, I suppose you're male," meaning a male, which already, he doesn't know Julie is a female, but he misspells it, M-A-I-L. Maybe that's to throw the judges off, but not certain. It would be no punctuation or anything. "It would be nice if you told me your gender." Julie: "I can help you with existing reservations, baggage policy, passenger services, or multi-ride services. Which would you like?" Eugene: "To some extent," I'm perhaps meaning extent. Meaningless answer. "Why? Where do you come from, by the way? Could you tell me about the place where you live?" Julie: "Sorry, I didn't understand. You can say existing reservations, baggage policy, passenger services, or multi-ride services. If none of these options match what you're looking for, say none of those. If you already have a reservation, say I have a reservation." Eugene: "The fact that you have a reservation won't change my attitude to you. By the way, what's your occupation? I mean, could you tell me about your work?" Julie then transfers the call to a human operator. And are you convinced? Because I got to tell you, I'm not convinced. So then I wondered, and we'll try to make this brief, I wondered what would happen if we administered the Myers-Briggs personality test to Eugene Goostman, who did not seem to be very much like a personality to me. So again, acting as Eugene's human interface, I took an online Myers-Briggs test, which begins, "I'm going to ask you some yes or no questions, okay? This is me talking to Eugene. Eugene: "I'm glad you agreed." What does that mean? "Could you tell me about your job, by the way?" First question, you are almost never late for your appointments, yes or no? Eugene, possibly you are right. You aren't the first one who tell me that. Where do you come from, by the way? Could you tell me about the place where you live? So Eugene doesn't understand we're taking a test. So almost passable answer. It's a yes or no question, Eugene. I wrote. I'm with you. Ooh, anything else? I don't think this is working. You like to be engaged in an active and fast-paced job, yes or no? I'm only 13, so I'm attending school so far. First good answer. You enjoy having a wide circle of acquaintances, yes or no? And yes, do you make a secret of your name? I still don't know it, exclamation point. I'm Richard. You feel involved when watching TV soaps, yes or no? In our country, TV is pretty boring, mostly news and old Soviet movies. That's actually a good answer. You are usually the first to react to a sudden event such as the telephone ringing or unexpected question, yes or no? Really? Oh, you always say banalities in the way like you present a situation. Well, it goes on like this. You tend to be unbiased, even if that might endanger your good relationships with people. Yes or no? Even my grandpa would find your words strange, etc. It is in your nature to assume responsibility. Yes or no? Sorry, ask me this question later. It seems too difficult to me today. You often think about humankind and its destiny. Yes or no? By the way, have you heard about how one Russian online translator translates bin Laden? It says trash can is full. Okay, I don't think we're really on the verge of artificial intelligence, but we'll be talking about that more shortly with futurist George Dvorsky and Pete Callahan, executive producer, has an interesting idea for Eugene's future. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard. But first, we'll talk about the GDP. We'll be right after this. Back right after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow. I'm talking like Eugene now. And this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us now is someone who's joined us before and is willing to come back. Sean McElwee is a researcher and writer based in New York. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, Policy Shop, Salon, The Atlantic, and Rolling Stone, and of course, the Zero Hour. Sean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on again.
Absolutely. And you and Lou Daly wrote a piece that I thought was excellent and gets to the heart of some of the issues we talk about here. It was a piece on why we should abolish the GDP. And you and Lou Daly wrote what was once a highly technical debate about the failures of conventional economic metrics is fast becoming a world movement to unseat GDP and replace it with something better. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So GDP, economists have always known this is flawed. Lou and I wrote a piece earlier for the New Republic discussing the fact that in the economics profession, these failures are widely known. We know that GDP doesn't measure, as Robert Kennedy said, the things that really matter that make us Americans. And so economists read these metrics very differently than most of us read the metrics. And so economists understand this. Most other Americans don't. And so what we've been trying to do is push metrics that tell you more about what's going on in society. For example, what if you're growing, but inequality means that most people aren't actually seeing any of that growth? What if you're growing, but you're doing it in a way that is very detrimental to the environment? And so far, Maryland, Oregon, Vermont are states in the United States that have worked to adopt GPI and use it to influence policymaking. And GPI takes into account social, economic, and environmental factors. Greenhouse gas emissions, crime, volunteer work are all included in the GPI. And so what you find out very quickly is that
and a lot GPI, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sean, but
yeah.
GPI stands for Genuine Progress Indicator.
Genuine Progress, yep. And what they find is that a lot of their growth has come at the expense of these other factors.
Well, you and Lou found an excellent quote from a group of social scientists writing in the Nature said if a business used GDP-style accounting, it would aim to maximize gross revenue, even at the expense of profitability, efficiency, sustainability, or flexibility. And I guess in the human way, so you're writing about the GPI, which takes into account 26 social, economic, and environmental indicators. If the GDP is such a gross measurement of, which it is, in my opinion, of economic status and economic conditions, and the GPI tracks closely with life satisfaction, as you and Daly point out, why is it so deeply entrenched in economics and policymaking, do you think?
I think GDP has really just taken on a life of its own. It originally began as just a wartime measure to determine how much production was happening. And that was really all it was supposed to tell you. Zachary Karabell writes in the Leading Indicators how these sorts of statistics, just like unemployment statistics, very much take on a life of their own and define the way that we see the economy, regardless of the widely known flaws with these metrics. John Kitzhaber in Oregon is even finding that a lot of business people are interested in something like the GPI because it takes into account things that they're concerned about, like early childhood education. Now, obviously, these are Oregon business people, so they're not quite the same. Oregon's a relatively liberal state. Most of the time we've seen this happening in liberal states, but I'm actually making a case shortly in the American Conservative for why conservatives should also be interested in the GPI.
Well, I think there's a great point, and John Kitzhaber, we should say, is the governor of Oregon, and it makes also a great deal of sense that a number of certain kinds of business would be interested. For example, if people, if growth is more equitably distributed, then consumers will have more to spend, which is of interest to a lot of businesses. If people are feeling a greater sense of well-being and add more celebratory, it could improve certain restaurant, movies, other types of entertainment, but on and on and on. So just the fact that it's more humanistic, the GPI or other alternate measurements, doesn't mean that they're not useful in all sorts of ways from government. You point out that the GDP doesn't measure the poverty rate, for example, and it certainly doesn't measure wage stagnation or the distribution of the growth or the fact that minimum wage has failed to keep pace with the growth in productivity. If it had since 1968, it would be in the $20 something range right now. So there are many ways, many parts of society that might be interested in a different approach. Why do you think conservatives would be interested?
Well, the first quote is Anthony Polini. He told me, he said, "We make these same policy choices every year, and we make the same mistakes, and we cut programs, and we deny the fact that we're hurting people and undermining their well-being." And I think that gets to the ultimate problem here, is that legislators and policymakers are judged on GDP, but no one even knows what that means. Why would conservatives be concerned? I think a lot of the things that social conservatives worry about, things like crime, for example, was obviously a bigger problem back in the 80s and the 70s. But like volunteerism, if you're working at a nearby church or hospital, and I think a lot of conservatives would like those sorts of social factors to be included when we're talking about progress. So I think that there is a reason to believe that conservatives would have at least some sympathy for the idea.
Well, and I would also throw in there the idea that conservatives are supposed to be for the entrepreneur and the startup person and the scrappy mom and pop businesses all around the country, and GDP fails to measure the things that would be of value to the startup, that the startup entrepreneur might want to know, or that the Main Street business might want to know. So I think there are a lot of ways you might be able to appeal to at least street-level conservatives, if not the institutional ones. So good for you, good on you, as they say, for reaching out to them. You also talk about some things that I know some people will react as, and I don't react this way, but as being a little flowery or hippie-ish, the gross national happiness index that Bhutan put together, or and yet when it sounds flowery, but it's a good idea. And Bobby Kennedy, as you mentioned, talked about that. Nicolas Sarkozy, former president of France, who is no lefty and no hippie, asked Joseph Stiglitz and a couple other folks to come Amartya Sen and Fatoussi to come up with the limits, define the limits of the GDP, and they mentioned happiness. So is happiness something that can and should be measured as part of economic metrics, you think?
Right, and I mean, I don't think personally that Bhutan's, what they're doing is trivial at all, but I understand why some people would say, hey, these sorts of surveys where you ask people how they're feeling might not be the best way to do it. And I say, great, that's fine if you believe that. GPI doesn't try to look at happiness. It's much like, the Human Development Index that Sen developed before he went on to this project. It doesn't try to measure happiness. It measures things like literacy rates and infant mortality. And so I think that at some point I hope to have a discussion about whether or not happiness should be included. Right now, I'm saying don't even worry about happiness. Let's talk about greenhouse gas emissions, because that is very important as a component for the future. If we're building growth at the expense of greenhouse gas emissions, we're not creating sustainable growth. And this is very disturbing when you find out that, fossil fuels are subsidized to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars implicitly, because we're not taking into account the huge externalities that they're creating. And if we actually measure that, solar energy would be incredibly competitive. So I don't think it's trivial, and we're not even talking about happiness. We're just talking about considering the other impacts of this growth.
So what do you think are the next steps in this debate? We've got a number of states adopting the GPI. We've got, which is the Genuine Progress Index, is it, or indicator? Indicator, yeah. And we've got people looking at other options. There's a debate going on, which you guys have participated valuably in. What happens next?
I think the first thing we need to do is keep making people aware. They already know that GDP doesn't tell them how their life is really going. That is clear enough, right? We've been officially out of recession for 5 years, but no one's feeling that. So we need to tell them what's going on, why this is not actually showing people what their lives are like. And we need to have more and more pilot programs like what we're having in these states to show that this isn't just some flowery academic idea. This is something that has real-world implications. Maryland has already tied their GPI to things like improving soil fertility and cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So tying it to real-world impacts so people see that this is a workable policy that has workable impacts, and just keep showing the failures and the illusions of the growth that we've had. And I think eventually we're going to have to see something like this at the federal level. John Kitzhaber says it's trickle-up governing. Washington doesn't do anything, so he's working on it. If California adopts this, it would be such a big example, because you would have one of the biggest economies in the world that is now taking into account the implications of greenhouse gas emissions when they're making policy decisions.
Well, we'll work on California, and we'll stay on this story, and I'm sure you will too. Sean McElwee, thanks so much for joining us. For now, we'll leave love and happiness to Al Green, and we'll leave the GPI to the states to experiment with. And thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and we will be right back after this to talk about artificial intelligence on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. We are now planning to discuss a little bit more this so-called artificial intelligence program named Eugene Goostman. And joining us in this segment is George Dvorsky. He is a Canadian futurist, a science writer and bioethicist. He is also a contributing editor to IO9, where he writes about science, culture, and futurism. He is producer of the Sentient Developments blog and podcast. He currently serves as chair of the board for the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies, IEET, where I am, or was, I think I still am, an affiliated scholar, and he has recently written on this topic. George, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, I want to start out by saying I did a segment earlier. We're going to do another segment on this whole Eugene Goostman, the artificial intelligence or the program that allegedly passed the Turing test earlier. And I mentioned a couple things which I want to get your thoughts on. One is that I had reviewed the so-called John Lennon artificial intelligence, I think maybe even for IEET a few years ago. and I called it "I Don't Believe in Turing," meaning the Turing test. And I had the same sensation interacting with the Eugene program that I had 20 years ago with Eliza, the psychotherapy program, which is that it's very easy to detect that this is not a human being. And I don't know why it passed the test, but you did a piece on this topic. Is not broadcastable, its title, which is to the effect of why the Turing test is BS, as we would say. Why is the Turing test BS, and why did everybody get so excited about this?
Well, I think the reason why everybody got so excited by it is that the Turing test is held in quite a high esteem. I mean, it does come from Alan Turing, who's such a well-respected computer scientist and the godfather of artificial intelligence and working on it. And I think people get very excited by it because they put a lot of credibility into it. And there's also, I mean, a certain intuitive aspect to it that, look, you know, if we can have a computer or a machine that can fool us into thinking it's human, then there's probably something to it. And this is exactly what Alan Turing thought back in the 1950s when he devised this test. He basically thought that, you know, that was one of the most sophisticated things that he could think of for a machine to do was to, you know, carry a conversation at a human equivalent level. And he figured that if eventually we could get to the stage where it fools enough people, then we might have to conclude that it is a thinking machine. And because that was ultimately the question that he was seeking to answer was, can machines think? And regrettably, his test has not stood the test of time because the ability to simulate a human conversation is actually quite easy, as you've discovered yourself through the work that you've done. And what it's resulted in is not so much endeavors toward artificial intelligence in the sense that Turing was imagining, i.e. thinking machines, but what it did is it started to set up an arms race between developers who are working on chatbots that can simulate human conversation. And they're not thinking in the sense that Alan Turing was wondering about. They're just script-driven, algorithm-driven programs that are strictly just trying to match what you're saying with something that it thinks it wants you to believe is real. And when I perhaps use this kind of language too loosely, because there's actually no thinking or pondering going on. It's just strictly script-based. So I guess to answer your question in short, simulating a human conversation is absolutely no measure of human-like intelligence in a machine.
Well, and I think it's so important that be reiterated because, I mean, I remember, here's how far back I've been arguing about this. There used to be a popular artificial leather called Naugahyde, and I used to say artificial conversation is no more proof of humanity than Naugahyde is proof of an artificial cow. You know, I mean, a cow is not its skin. You simulate the skin, you haven't simulated the cow. Conversation is a human output. I happen to think these programs, including Eugene, are poorly written and algorithms easy to spot. But I think the point you're making, and it's an important one, is that even a much more effective program would still just be a program, right? And
that's correct. And another way of looking at this is looking in the ways that the Turing test could, I guess, fail when there is an intelligence present. So let's take, for example, great apes like bonobos and chimpanzees. They would fail a Turing test quite spectacularly. And no one would ever for a minute believe that, there's no intelligence there. These are extremely inquisitive, very empathetic creatures. They exhibit, human levels of intelligence, even sometimes greater than human levels of intelligence. For example, chimpanzees can defeat humans at memorization tasks. Yet we don't deny them, this intelligence. So again, by just strictly looking at human conversation and language in that sense, it's very limiting in terms of what it's actually trying to gauge and measure.
And I think you have made an important distinction, which is, first of all, when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's a debate about the nature of human intelligence, number one. And I say that by way of background. We have the discussion about what is emotional intelligence, what are the dimensionalities of human intelligence and human awareness. But you have also used the term artificial consciousness because I think it should be incontrovertible that a great ape is a consciousness. And many living things are consciousnesses. And so it's possible to perform some intelligence like functions without possessing consciousness. Is that true? Fair?
I think that is very fair, and I'm glad you brought that up because we are discussing two different things, and that's a level of nuance that's often lost in this conversation when we are talking about the Turing test. I think that when we're talking about machine intelligence or when machines are thinking, it's very important as to what we're describing. I think you can have machines, like we will have them in the future, that will be exhibiting greater than human levels of intelligence across a wide spectrum of areas. Yet there will not be that kind of internal, subjective element. It will not be conscious or self-aware or sentient in the sense that we humans are and some other animals are as well. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But also, yes, there also will be perhaps the need, and this might point more to what Alan Turing was hinting at, is can we have this kind of subjective awareness emergent in a computer or in a machine at some point. And this is going to be very challenging because we can't even measure that in humans. I just have to take it for granted that you're a conscious entity. I have to take it for granted that everybody around me is conscious. I'm not going to slip into any kind of solipsism. I pretty much take that for granted. But we lack the science yet, and we lack the mechanisms with which we can actually definitively flesh that out and say, and point to that part of the brain and say, aha, there is consciousness. That's what's giving rise to self-awareness. And we need to be able to figure out the same thing in machines. And that's going to be the ultimate Turing test, is our ability to do that. So the challenge is out there. The challenge is out there for people to come up with a Turing test 2.0, if you will, so that we can, in fact, measure conscious awareness in a machine.
And in a sense, that is a test of us as well as a test of the machine. And, of course, I have to assume not only that you possess consciousness, I'm assuming that I possess consciousness, but I'm not sure we want to go this deep. But one of the interesting things about and exciting things about this conversation for me, in addition to the fascinating question about when would we know that a machine possesses consciousness, is that you are one of those people who has been led, I think, by this kind of line of inquiry into championing and advocating for the rights of what we now, some people describe as non-human persons, including great apes, including bonobos. We've had attorneys for the Animal Rights Project in New York State who were fighting for chimpanzees being kept in inhumane conditions in court, fighting for them to achieve legitimacy in court and so on. And how you are, I believe, chair of the IEET's Rights of Non-Human Persons program. Tell us what a non-human person is and why it interests you.
Yeah, a non-human person is an agent that exhibits a number of characteristics, such as a sense of self, the ability to project oneself into the future. So in other words, knowing that you're going to exist in the future and that there's going to be consequences for your actions. Also a certain degree of empathy, like understanding that other minds do exist and you have to be considerate of those minds, but also that you can trick and fool those minds as well. And also a sense of history, so that you've actually got a past and there is this narrative that runs through your life, and so on and so forth. And humans, obviously, we are persons in that sense. We do have many of those characteristics, as do many non-human animals, such as great apes, cetaceans, such as dolphins and whales, and elephants, and perhaps some other animals as well. And what we're trying to do with the Rights of Non-Human Persons program is secure personhood protections for these animals, such that you can't torture them, that you can't kill them arbitrarily, you can't confine them, can't experiment on them, and so on. And one of the reasons for actually even kindling this program was the consideration that eventually we'll have this kind of awareness in machines, and that they're going to move from the objects of our inquiry to objects of moral consideration, and that we'll have to suddenly be aware that there's the potential for harm, that if they can feel things, if they can be emotional, if they actually have an agenda and motivations and a desire to live and a desire to not be manipulated, then we're going to have to be respectful of that. And I looked at it as a part of a broader conversation. I thought, if we're going to get people on board the idea of machine personhood, we still have to also get people on board the idea that there's this thing called animal personhood as well. It's part of, like I said, a huge conversation and a recognition as to what constitutes a morally relevant entity, whether it be machine-based or an animal.
It's a fascinating topic, and I've had people say, well, if I created it, why can't I do what I want with it? My answer is I'd hate to be your kid.
Exactly. That's a fair analogy.
George Dvorsky, thanks so much for joining us on this really fascinating topic, and I hope you'll come back again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And we're going to come back right after this with a little bit more about this topic with executive producer Pete Callahan of our very own Zero Hour. We will be right back after this. And we're back on the Zero Hour. And for our final segment, a special treat for Zero Hour regulars. The man behind the machinery, executive producer, one of them, and certainly valuable leader of the team, executive producer Peter James Callahan, Pete Callahan, is going to step up to the mic and drop a few passages about his own experience with the Eugene artificial intelligence program. We're going to kind of bat that one back and forth a little bit. We had fun brainstorming all of this week, and here we go. Pete, you with me?
I am with you, RJ. So basically, we were on a production call earlier in the week. We're talking about what we're going to do on the show this week. We kind of all came to the idea that, we can feed the Briggs-Myers through it. We can have it do Amtrak customer service or call a hotel chain. One of the things I came to the conclusion of was, if it's a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy who in a lot of ways would be seen as an immigrant in this country, as a at-risk population for things like sexual abuse and stuff like that, why don't we try to feed some of the To Catch a Predator transcripts that are readily available online at perverted-justice.com, which is the group that kind of does all that stuff with NBC Dateline to catch all these creepy guys online. So,
and tell us just briefly what To Catch a Predator is all about.
So it's that NBC's news division, I guess you can call it, but it's more like infotainment, has a show where they have people from Perverted Justice pose as like 13-year-old girls or boys, for the most part, in that age range, on the internet, and kind of just troll all the teen-based chat rooms for men looking to hook up illegally with very, very much younger children. So the transcripts are pretty scary, but instead of reading tons of excerpts from this, because none of it's actually that funny once you've read through all this bunch now, but
I'm sure.
Yeah. But the thing is, he stands up pretty well to them, and some of his stupid questions, like the pivoting to where are you from, is something that happens a lot in these conversations, actually. It was a little scarring reading all these transcripts, but that kind of led me with reading Kevin Warwick's quote in the press release that University of Reading put out about it. And he kind of went in one direction that I think is something that's a real thing, but I kind of went in a different direction.
What is that? What was that quote?
So he said, having a computer that can trick a human into thinking that someone or something is a person we trust is a wake-up call to cybercrime, and the test is a vital tool for combating this threat. Whereas I kind of saw it from the lens of George Orwell, where, yes, it can be used for cybercrime. There's been rumors since Ashley Madison, the cheating affair dating site that's now much more popular than it was in its infancy, came out. There was tons of reports from people that were on the site that it felt like there was tons of bots contacting them and with very, very vague things and asking them for money. So, and there's been other things like that on less reputable dating sites that people have complained about, that, there's all these fake women that aren't even actual employees of the company for the most part, but it seems like they're actually bots. So instead of the cybercrime thing and looking at it that way, I kind of came to the conclusion that I think that this could be used in a very, very sinister way by governments if you tweak the program ever so slightly.
Or it could be used in a sense, so that my criticism was that it couldn't handle most reasonable tests of intelligence, even for a 13-year-old, like answering a yes or no question, but that it could, your thought was, on the other hand, it could be used to entrap adult predators, right? Is that what you were thinking?
Adult predators, and then I've kind of thought about it more, too. And the adult predators, I think, would be easy, but any kind of tight, ideologically driven, in this case, their ideologies being pedophiles, but ideologically driven rhetorical space where you could tweak the program, I think, And it could be used to set up Twitter bots during the Arab Spring that would incite people to violence, like the FBI did with the New Left in the 60s and 70s with their informants. I thought it could also be used in a lot of ways to either spread misinformation, entrap people like the pedophiles, or to gain intelligence from unknowing humans, especially if they're not the most intelligent of humans and they're very ideologically driven. Like if you wanted to set off the Bundy Ranch people, all you have to do is embed a couple of, slightly more nuanced bots, but really just more focused on a specialty, I think, that could then prove to be kind of a way a government could intrude on a discursive space, I guess, and turn it in their favor.
So yeah, let me recap what I understand so far, because what's interesting about this is it's starting to tie together our two major topics of the day, being, the violence and the gender violence and the political violence of Iraq. It's starting to kind of tie everything together at the conclusion. But so you went, and I was a little worried about you immersing yourself in, it was tough, I know, in the sordidness of these predator scripts, these To Catch a Predator scripts.
And a funny aside, while I was working on this yesterday, Eugene shut down and has not been back online till at least 10 minutes ago.
Well, yeah, it is interesting, but that is interesting, actually, but we should try to find out about that. But okay, so you did this. It was a dark experience, but you found that Eugene's weaknesses somehow conformed with that script, and then the thought was other sort of sinister applications. And so, for example, inciting the Bundy Ranch types to violence, or maybe street demonstrations somewhere. But how would that work exactly? I mean, I wasn't blown away by Eugene's sophistication. So how would that, I mean, it's a fascinating idea, but how would it happen? So in other words, people would be, like, he would tweet out inflammatory
tweet stuff, or in chat rooms or forums or stuff like that. He would join the conversation. The way I envisioned it with the technology we have now, it could be used kind of as a dragnet like the NSA does, but a more active one. Like the NSA is putting people on World of Warcraft and stuff like that. You could have bots like this that can go, 20 lines or so effectively, as long as they're talking in a very rigid space, where then you find out that separates the wheat from the chaff in terms of people the government could be interested in, and then you have human people take over for the bot at some point in the conversation.
So for all we know, I mean, it's a fascinating idea, and these scripted interactions would be perfect for it. It could record anybody who took the bait. It could be on a million conversations at once, or 1,000 conversations at once. We don't know what's not happening now. So really interesting work.
And with revelations that, Greenwald said recently, the British version of the NSA is actively, not necessarily against their citizens for the most part, it seems like, but has been doing character assassination stuff with people in foreign countries and British nationals. And this could be something that could be easily tied to that.
Well, it's a scary thought that a program that is not conscious in any way could be doing the bidding of people who are consciously doing harm. Pete, thanks for all the great work and the great thinking, and thanks for a story that ties all the elements of this episode together. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow. Please join us next week. This is The Zero Hour.